Hey, What Next listeners? It's Mary Harris. Before we get to today's episode, I have a favor to ask. This relationship feels slightly one-sided. Just me talking to you all the time. We want to change that. We have a listener survey we want you to fill out. It's going to really help us do the show better. And we'll hear from you. What you want, what you need, what you love, what you hate. All of that stuff. You can find the survey in our show notes for all the latest episodes, or you can visit slate.com/whatnextsurvey. Okay, on to the show. I probably don't have to remind you about the language Donald Trump is using to refer to immigrants in the closing weeks of his campaign. But it's bracing, to quote the man who would be president, and sit with his words for a bit. So I'll do it anyway. Trump has called immigrants animals, stone-cold killers. He's called them the worst people, an enemy within. Or, as Rogé Karma puts it at The Atlantic,
I would broadly characterize Donald Trump's description of immigrants as a psychopathic horde of murderers. He talks about them coming from insane asylums, from mental institutions, from jails and prisons, and he has continuously put forward as his big policy what he said is going to be the largest deportation campaign in American history.
This is not exactly a surprise. From the moment he declared his candidacy back in 2015, immigration has been central to Trump's message. He famously rode down his golden escalator and called immigrants rapists. And then he won the presidency. But listen to Trump this year, Rogé says, and you'll hear the way this argument has been honed, sharpened.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the next president of the United States, President Donald J. Trump. And I'm proud to be an American.
I'll tell you the moment that caught my attention. I was watching a Trump rally in Atlanta.
I know so many of the people, all these people. They're tough as hell. They're from Georgia.
And Trump will play these videos, kind of mashups of news clips with ominous music.
And they are vicious as hell. Take a look at it.
Open borders, deadly consequences.
Border crisis, record high crossings.
And he did that a little bit into his speech. And it was just story after story about migrants who had murdered Americans, essentially.
More than 13,000 illegal immigrants convicted of murder have been released into the United States.
After this video played, the crowd clapped. And then Trump said, the U.S. is an occupied country, and when he's in office, it's going to be Liberation Day in America. And then there's more applause, which shows you that people are kind of hungry for this message.
Yeah, and the thing is, it's actually right now, Pew just came out with a bunch of polling on immigration a couple weeks ago. And one of the findings was that 56% of Americans, including 88% of Trump supporters and 28% of Kamala Harris supporters, support mass deportation.
Yeah, we're talking about Trump's rhetoric at his rallies, but I'm sort of curious. You lay out this data that really a lot of Americans are thinking about immigration in new ways, much more kind of carceral, punitive ways. Is the overheated rhetoric just a Republican thing?
Absolutely not. Kamala Harris's position on immigration is we have to fortify the border. And the policy she's endorsed is a border security bill that would have been considered a Republican wish list just a few years ago. And so the rhetoric from Democrats has really changed. The policies have really changed. I would say that's in some ways an even bigger change than Trump's shift in rhetoric is on the Democratic side.
Today on the show, how voters in the U.S. swung to the right on immigration, and what it means that politicians are swinging right along with them. I'm Mary Harris. You're listening to What Next? Stick around. This episode is brought to you by Cozy Earth. Fall into comfort this season with Cozy Earth. Whether you are curling up at night or stepping out of the bath, Cozy Earth's sustainable luxe products will keep you warm and comfortable all season long. Cozy Earth passed on to me some of their bamboo sheets, which are really great. They're made from 100% premium viscose from bamboo. They come in great colors, like I got this nice burnt orange, perfect for fall. They're breathable, they're uniquely soft, and they only get softer with every wash. Cozy Earth's long-sleeve bamboo pajama set is another timeless classic if you want to go for that. It's crafted with a soft stretch knit that features enhanced breathability and luxurious drape. This lightweight set sleeps degrees cooler than cotton to keep your temperature just right through the night. Plus, their incredibly soft and highly absorbent bath sheets make them perfect for indulgent post-bath rituals. Wrap yourself in luxury this fall with Cozy Earth. Go to cozyearth.com/whatnext and use code WhatNext for an exclusive discount up to 40% off. That's cozyearth.com/whatnext. If you get a post-purchase survey, say you heard about Cozy Earth from What Next podcast. This show is brought to you by Discover. Have you heard about Doublenomics? It's okay if you haven't. It's extremely niche and practiced by Discover. Here's an example. Discover automatically doubles the cash back earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cashback Match. That means with Discover, you could turn $150 cash back into $300. It pays to Discover. See terms at discover.com/creditcard. Okay, so we've talked about how in this election, both presidential candidates are trying to present themselves as tough on the border. I want to dig a bit more into the polling numbers. What do they tell us about why politicians may be making this shift? Like, I know you and others have focused on Gallup polling. What does it explain about the last year, but then also maybe the last decade or so about how public opinion here has swung back and forth?
I'm glad you asked about the polling, because I think this is really what's underlying this massive shift in rhetoric. Because underlying this shift in rhetoric is quite possibly the most dramatic swing in public opinion in the last few decades, possibly, going back even further.
When you say dramatic, what do you mean?
So you mentioned Gallup, and Gallup asks voters every year going back to the 1960s, do you believe we should increase levels of immigration, decrease levels of immigration, or keep them the same? In 2020, 28% of Americans said that we should decrease immigration levels. In fact, more Americans at that point said we should increase immigration levels. By 2024, the percentage of Americans who said that immigration should be decreased had increased to 56%, which is almost double.
Whoa.
That shift has happened among Republicans. It's happened among Democrats. It's happened among independents. Republicans are the biggest shift, but the other two have moved a lot as well. And when I say dramatic, here's what I mean. The issue that I think most people think about when they think about big changes in public opinion over time is gay marriage, the increasing support for gay marriage. Support for gay marriage, according to Gallup's polling, increased about 20 points over the course of around a decade, maybe 8 or 9 years. Here, we're talking about a near 30-point shift in 4 years. When I say dramatic, I mean both the speed and the size of this is really unprecedented.
Does it translate to increased support for specific policy measures, like, say, building a border wall?
That question is tricky because the answer is yes on some policies and not yes on others. So when it comes to mass deportations of immigrants living in the country illegally, and I'm taking this not from Gallup, this is from Pew, a September poll. And again, it was 56% of voters said that they're in support of mass deportations of immigrants living in the country illegally. 88% said they wanted to improve security along the country's borders. And that was including 80% of Democrats. So basically what was at one point more or less a Trump position that abhorred Democrats has now become the overwhelming majority position. That is now considered the moderate position. The moderate sort of centrist Democrat position is now we need to fortify border security. And the sort of now Trump position is we need to deport millions of immigrants living in the country illegally. At the same time, what's interesting an interesting sort of disparity in some of the polling is that there are other policies in which Americans still seem broadly supportive of immigration. 70% of voters, including 55% of Republicans, say they want to admit immigrants who can fill labor shortages. 79% of voters want to admit more high-skilled immigrants. 51% of voters say that admitting immigrants from all over the world is important to ensure a diverse immigrant population.
It sounds like Americans are kind of confused about immigration. Like somehow they've picked up a strong yuck factor, but they actually, like the things immigration does, they're into.
I think this gets to the question you asked about why this public opinion shift is occurring. There are two big reasons that I focus on. One is what political scientists call thermostatic public opinion, which is basically the idea that the public's views on things tend to move in the opposite direction of the sitting president's rhetoric and policies and priorities.
Which would make a shift like this kind of predictable, right? We've had Biden in office for 4 years, so we're swinging in a different direction.
Yes, and the opposite happened under Trump. Under Trump, the percentage of Democrats who said we should increase immigration shot up by 20 points, more than it had in the entire previous 15 years.
Well, and supporting this theory is also evidence that opinion is swung on other issues, like crime, too. Like in June 2020, 47% of Americans were satisfied with federal anti-crime policies. Now it's 28%. So it's like that's another kind of swingy thing associated with the Democrats in office. It boosts this thermostatic idea.
Yes, but I don't think it's the entire story. And the reason I say that is because the biggest single-year shift in this entire 4 years came between June 2023 and June 2024. And that is just the single largest one-year shift in the history of Gallup polling this issue going back to the 1960s.
What was happening then?
Basically, in 2023, we hit a record number of what are called euphemistically border encounters, which are basically the apprehension of immigrants, undocumented immigrants at the border by a Border Patrol agent.
So things looked chaotic.
Yeah, and this was like a big shift, a big surge. And our immigration system just did not handle it well.
Well, and buses started heading from the border up to cities like New York and Chicago and Denver, too, right?
Exactly. Texas Governor Greg Abbott decides he's going to start busing tens of thousands of immigrants. At this point, it is now about 120,000 immigrants to liberal cities like New York and Chicago and Denver. And all of a sudden, their homeless shelters are overcrowded. There are migrants sleeping on the streets. Public officials start freaking out. Public services are being strained. Eric Adams, the mayor of New York, at one point talks about this as, being the end of New York. And so you see sort of this chaos both being portrayed at the border and then sort of being exported to blue cities. And I think that can explain a lot of the sort of shift in public opinion. I do think that busing program was basically engineered to create chaos. That cities like New York and Chicago actually take in much higher levels of immigrants. It is exactly because most immigrants, when they go to a city, they are, have family there or they have job opportunities. There's a reason they're going to that city. Whereas with Abbott's busing program, he sent people who didn't even really fully know where they were going to these cities. There was no coordination. There was no plan. And so basically, it's not that these cities just couldn't handle immigration. They do all the time. It was that this specific kind of busing of immigrants was specifically designed to create chaos, and it did.
Yeah. I mean, not to take up the Democrats' talking points, but the Republicans, it's good for them when it looks chaotic, and they know that, as if they're not in charge, at least.
Chaos also is not an inherent feature of a high level of immigration, right? The reform to our immigration system has been kicked down the road for decades at this point. Often the bills that would actually help this have been spiked by Republicans. And I think the generous read is, well, this is just dysfunctional Washington. I think the more cynical read is this chaos, to your point, really helps Republicans politically. And we saw a great example of that earlier this year, more explicitly, when congressional Democrats and Republicans had agreed to a bipartisan border security bill that was, quite frankly, a Republican wish list of border enforcement policies. And it was killed when Donald Trump came out against it, mostly because, he realizes that this is the single issue he can run on. If it got solved, he wouldn't be able to do it anymore.
After the break, what the data actually says about immigrants and the economy. This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are the things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Because Progressive offers discounts for paying in full, owning a home, and more. Plus, you can count on their great customer service to help you when you need it. So your dollar goes a long way. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save on car insurance. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states or situations. This show is brought to you by Discover. Have you heard about Doublenomics? It's okay if you haven't. It's extremely niche and practiced by Discover. Here's an example. Discover automatically doubles the cash back earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cashback Match. That means with Discover, you could turn $150 cash back into $300. It pays to Discover. See terms at discover.com/creditcard. I wonder if you and I can talk about the reasoning that I think politicians use for why they might crack down on the border or crack down on migration. I think a lot of people in politics focus on the idea that new migrants to this country might be taking jobs away from U.S. citizens. But you've actually pointed out this is a pretty well-studied corner of economics. So what does the data tell us about this talking point?
Amongst all the claims that Donald Trump and J.D. Vance have made about immigrants, one of them consistently is that immigrants undercut the wages and the job opportunities of American workers. And one of the justifications for Trump's border deportation policy is that it will benefit American workers. J.D. Vance said this in the vice presidential debate.
And this is something that seems to make common sense, right? If people are here, of course, obviously they will take jobs that maybe someone else could have taken.
It's a standard sort of Econ 101 argument, right? When the sort of supply of new workers comes into a country, they are going to, occupy more jobs. The supply of labor increases. That causes the price of labor or wages to decrease. It's a very common sense, intuitive argument. And it just turns out to actually be completely untrue. One of the most famous studies of this is of the Mariel boat lift in 1980, in which over 100,000 Cuban refugees left Cuba and came to Miami, Florida. And that allowed economists to sort of isolate, okay, we saw this massive influx in the immigrant workforce of Miami. How does the trajectory of wages in Miami compare to other cities? And what they found was it had virtually no effect, not on workers generally, even workers without a college degree. There were further studies that found even workers without a high school degree.
That's so surprising. Where did those workers go?
I think this is where it comes to the biggest mistake about thinking about immigration economics is we think about immigrants only as workers. But immigrants and people generally, they aren't just workers. They're also consumers who buy lots of things. They buy haircuts and healthcare and housing. And so at the same time that immigrants are, quote unquote, taking jobs, they're spending lots of money. It sounds counterintuitive, but when you just think about it in a slightly different context, you don't see Republicans going to high school graduations, like yelling at graduates that they're going to enter the workforce and take American jobs. And that's because we intuitively understand that, like, that's not how population growth works, right? People add to the economy on both the demand and the supply side. And I think in a lot of our rhetoric, we've kind of forgotten that when it comes to immigration. And the last thing I'll just say on this is look at the last few years. We have had a huge surge of immigration at the same time that we've had historic low levels of unemployment. We've had rising real wages for the bottom of the income distribution at their fastest pace since the 1940s. There's this huge freak out over immigration. There's this huge panic about immigration. But actually, the economic prospects of native-born Americans have rarely been better, at least in the last few decades.
Yeah. I mean, you've noted a couple things here. First of all, that your own family's story is an anecdote that sort of supports this idea because your family came here from Lebanon. Is that right?
Yeah, my grandparents both grew up in Lebanon. Their families were actually both refugees from other countries in the Middle East. And they came to the U.S. Without documentation in the 1960s. And my grandpa worked a series of odd jobs, jumping from job to job, only up until the point where they would ask for his papers, which had expired, at which point he would switch jobs. But eventually, they found some stability. He ended up getting a job as a mechanic. What happened next, where he ends up working, in this very American dream type way, from the mechanic to the manager of the station, to owning it, to buying a bunch of other stations. By the end of his career, he's employing dozens of native-born workers. His stations have become sort of a pillar of local gathering and of the community. And so I think that example sticks in my head because it's an example of, in addition to the fact that we don't think immigrants have, a huge effect on native-born wages, there are so many things, so many positive things about immigrants that are like just not even captured by these studies at all. And I think his story their story really speaks to that.
Yeah. One of the main promises, especially when you listen to Donald Trump and what he's telling the people who come to his rallies, one of the main promises he makes is removing migrants. He talks about using the Alien Enemies Act to round people up, eventually remove them from the country. You've actually written about how that deporting people can hurt American workers too. Can you explain?
Of course. I think the best study on this was of what's called the Secure Communities Program, which was a Department of Homeland Security program during the Obama administration that deported about 500,000 immigrants between 2008 and 2014. And what they found was for every 100 immigrants that were deported, there were actually around 9 fewer jobs for natives. 100 immigrants left. And it's not only that there weren't 100 more jobs for natives, there were actually fewer jobs for natives. And study after study finds the same thing. It turns out that when you pull immigrants out of their communities, you create a lot of collateral damage, that a lot of American workers depend on immigrant workers, that a lot of sort of businesses will absolutely just shut down, have to fire people or shut down altogether when they don't have enough workers. So it's not the simple story of you deport a bunch of Americans and the lives of American workers get better. It's actually the exact opposite.
So here we are. We're in the final days of a presidential race. And I think we can both agree that Donald Trump's rhetoric here is incorrect, inflammatory. When it comes to Democrats, though, I'm curious if you see what they're doing as a move to the center that meets voters where they are, or something more troubling.
I very much see the shift in Democratic rhetoric. I think they're really following where the public is on this. I think the good news, the thing that makes me hopeful, is that if you buy the sort of chaos theory of immigration, that it is sort of the disorder associated with immigration that is causing these opinions to change and therefore causing the rhetoric to change, Well, that implies that actually this is one of the few areas where policy can matter, where policy can make a difference. Because if you can make the immigration system less chaotic and more orderly, then maybe you can sort of try to dial back some of this public sentiment.
Those are big ifs there.
Yes, but this is what makes me a little bit more hopeful. Early this year, Joe Biden issued a series of executive orders that were doing a lot of what that bipartisan border security bill was supposed to do. It was including, and I think this was the most sort of aggressive measure, allowing the sort of processing of asylum claims at the border to be shut down completely if immigration reached a daily average of 2,500 per day. So basically, this was saying if immigration gets too high, we're gonna shut everything down. We're also gonna do a lot to try to expedite the process to make it faster. None of this sounds like good things. This is trying to patch up a absolutely flailing system. This is not the kind of comprehensive reform that I think anyone would want.
But did it work?
That's the thing. Since though that order was issued in June, border crossings have plummeted. They're now at their lowest level in the entire Biden administration, arguably down to where they were for much of Trump's administration. And we don't have really good polling on how attitudes have shifted over the last few months because Gallup only does this once every year. But what Gallup does do very frequently is they ask voters, what is the most important issue you think is facing the country? They do that every month. And earlier this year, that was around 30%. Now it's closer to 20%. And that gives me some cautious optimism that this can be solved.
Rogé, I'm really grateful for your time. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Mary. It's been a pleasure.
Rogé Karma is a staff writer over at The Atlantic. And that is our show. Just a reminder that until November, we are teaming up with Slate Politics to bring you The Surge. Every Friday, it's right there in your feed. It's me and Jim Newell, who's Slate's political guru, talking about the top political news of the week. Who's surging? Who's not? If you want to hear The Surge, though, you have to join Slate Plus. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts by clicking Try Free at the top of the What Next page. Or you can visit slate.com/whatnextplus to get access wherever you listen. You'll get bonus content and plus no ads on any podcasts, like this one. The Surge is available for you to listen to every Friday after lunch, so go check it out. What Next is produced by Paige Osburn, Elena Schwartz, Rob Gunther, Anna Phillips, and Madeline Ducharme. We're led by Alicia Montgomery. Ben Richmond is the Senior Director of Podcast Operations here at Slate. And I'm Mary Harris. Thanks for listening. Talk to you next time. Hey, it's Mary again. Thanks for sticking around to the end of this episode. Before I say goodbye for the day, quick reminder to take our listener survey that we're running this month. We want to make sure your voice is heard. Visit the show notes or slate.com/whatnextsurvey. It'll only take a few minutes, I promise. Totally painless. Thanks again. I'll see you next episode.